let's look at the diaries of major State Department official in the first half of the 20th century and into the Cold War, a guy named Loy Henderson. He's got about 500 pages of memoirs that I got from a library, and I scanned the entire book, and at some point I'll make that PDF available online for any of you if you are researchers of communism, the Cold War, and that kind of thing. This book particularly deals with his time during the Roosevelt administration, in which he was the charge d'affaires, or the not the ambassador to the Soviet Union, but the guy who's running the embassy on a day-to-day basis, while, for instance, the Jewish financier Samuel Untermeyer, while his nephew or something like that is actually the actual Roosevelt appointee to be ambassador to the Soviet Union. You had these old legacy Americans like Loy Henderson, whose people have been in this country for hundreds of years, who are well educated, high IQ, have high ethics and morals, and want to do good for their country, and they're the ones who actually run the operations on a day-to-day basis, while the alien, the invader, the Roosevelt crew are making all the political decisions. So how nice for them. If we read this, we'll understand a little bit more, I think, about why the Trump era was such a catastrophe. This is page 224. I'd been on duty in Washington when Coolidge, that's Calvin Coolidge, of course, the president, Republican president, had been sworn in for his second term as president in March 1925. There was comparatively little excitement in the State Department at that time. Although Kellogg was to replace Hughes as the Secretary of State, and several changes were contemplated among the top personnel of the department, no upheaval had been anticipated. It was generally understood in 1933, however, that Roosevelt intended to make sweeping changes in both the foreign and domestic policies of the United States, and to replace, to the extent that the civil service and other regulations would permit, personnel who had come into the government during the 12 years of Republican administration. According to apparently inspired press reports, there was to be a complete New Deal. Moth-eaten bureaucrats and unimaginative personnel were to be replaced by bright, shining, and forward-looking activists. So doesn't this have something of a parallel to the Donald Trump idea in 2016? We've had, 16 years of Bush-Obama continuity. Everyone was pissed off with that, wanted something new, something different. The guy says, we're going to drain the swamp, we're going to go in there and we're going to clean it out, we're going to have a new popular nationalist or national populist direction for the country, although of a civic, not racial variety, but still. Criticism of the State Department by pro-New Deal columnists and editorial writers was particularly severe. There were insistent demands that the reactionaries be rooted out and replaced by persons who could be depended upon to carry out enlightened New Deal policies. The results of the anticipated purge of the department were highly unsatisfactory to many Democrats, particularly to the New Dealers hungry for jobs. It was not easy to create vacancies in a department of approximately 800 members when about 700 of them had either civil service or foreign service status. Similarly, the officer positions in our diplomatic and consular offices abroad, other than those occupied by chiefs of missions, were filled by members of the Foreign Service or by officers of the Department of Commerce and of the Armed Services. There were, however, a number of ambassadorships and ministerships that could be bestowed upon deserving Democrats. Furthermore, there were quite a number of unfilled, non-officer positions in our embassies, legations, and consular offices. The appetite for jobs in the State Department was so strong that in the middle of March 1933, a special team was sent in to examine the situation. We did not know whence the members of this team derived their authority, whether they were working for the White House, the Bureau of the Budget, or the Democratic Party. In any event, They systematically entered every office in the department in their search for fugitive bureaucrats not protected by civil service or foreign service legislation. A young man, perhaps 30 years of age, had apparently been assigned to explore the bureaucratic jungle on the third floor. We observed him with notebook in hand going from office to office. Eventually, he barged into the room occupied by Orson Nielsen and myself. Not troubling to introduce himself, he ordered Nielsen and me to give him our names and our status and to describe our activities. Ignoring his overbearing attitude, we gave him our names, told him we were Foreign Service officers, added that we were working on matters relating to Eastern Europe. "What?" he said with a mixture of disgust and contempt in his voice. What more of these Foreign Service officers? Oh, hell!" He snapped shut his notebook, turned on his heel, and left the office as abruptly as he had entered. This team was successful in unearthing a few members of the State Department who had neither civil service nor foreign service status. Most of them were replaced almost immediately by deserving Democrats or friends of deserving Democrats. Some of the new appointees were so clearly unfitted for the work assigned to them, that they did not remain long in the department. Some glorying in the fact that they were participants. Hold on just a minute. Some glorying in the fact that they were participants in the New Deal and were therefore close to the seat of power, assumed at first a patronizing attitude toward the permanent personnel. As the more capable New Deal infiltrators became immersed in the work, and as they discovered that the permanent personnel sincerely wanted to help them, the dividing line between them and the career personnel of the department tended to disappear. Some of the new arrivals were clearly persons of ability, not mere job hunters, who desired to engage in public service. They soon earned the respect of the permanent members. In fact, some of them over the years attained career status. Carr, as the chief administrator of the department, fought manfully to protect the career people and the Foreign Service from eager job hunters. Now get this. If a person of less stamina and prestige had occupied his position, the Foreign Service would probably have been torn to shreds, and the protective cover would have been entirely removed from the civil service employees. Even the secretary, under pressure from the White House, the politically minded Budget Bureau, and some members of Congress insisted that Carr take more energetic measures to separate officers and clerks from their respective positions so that vacancies could be created for New Deal Democrats. By the middle of the summer, approximately 70 officers and nearly 150 clerical employees who'd been serving in our offices abroad had been removed from their positions, and slightly over 20 officers and 60 clerical employees of the department had been released. Carr refused to accept suggestions from the Budget Bureau that he quote-unquote unblanket appointments of a quote-unquote political character that had been covered up by the civil service during the previous administration. He maintained that political appointments had not been given career cover in the department during previous years. He was compelled, however, during the latter part of 1933, under direct orders from Cordell Hull, one of the biggest, can't even come up with words to describe it at that time, but anyhow, under direct orders from Cordell Hull, to effect a fictitious type of reorganization that would justify the release of a limited number of the permanent members and permit the filling of the newly created positions by friends of members of the administration. In spite of the attitude of indifference, at times approaching almost contempt, that President Roosevelt manifested toward the State Department and the Foreign Service, and of the sustained campaign of vilification carried on against these two institutions by the left wing of the New Deal, both the Department and the Foreign Service weathered the change of the administration surprisingly well. The Department of Commerce and its Foreign Service, however, fared badly. So then we don't need to get into that. Now let's just talk, this last part here, talking about people who got fired, they lost their, people who'd been overseas for 10 or 15 years doing this stuff, They'd lost contact with their home communities. They didn't know where to get jobs. And when they finally were called home because of these Roosevelt shenanigans, they killed themselves. So these people who formerly were doing good work, they thought they'd been hired as a career, so you're going to go and live in, Colombia? You're going to go live in South America for 10 years and help American businessmen arrange trade deals with Colombian businessmen. You think you do it for 3 or 4 or 5, 10 years, and then suddenly one day you get a call from the government saying, come home, you're fired. And then what do? Now you got a Colombian wife and some kids or something? I don't know. But anyhow, Loy Henderson is saying that some of these people killed themselves on their way home or shortly after their return. So what do we learn from this? We learned that Roosevelt and his people had the killer instinct. All right? They had a killer instinct. As soon as they won, they knew what they wanted to do. They wanted to take over every aspect of the American government to the extent that they were able. Okay, they did that. They got 100 people, right? They said we had 800 employees, 700 of them had cover, so we replaced 100 of them immediately. And then we spent another year, and we got another 200 of them out, right? So this is what Donald Trump and his people never were seemingly ever able to do. They never fought for this kind of stuff. They never tried to push the boundaries. They never tried to replace all these people. They left these goddamn bureaucrats alone. Now, since Roosevelt was so pro-communist and so liberal and such an internationalist piece of filth, he had to get rid of these people like Loy Henderson out of his State Department to the extent that he was able. And apparently replacing 300 out of 800 of them just wasn't good enough. He didn't get rid of enough of them. So if you read the other history books, you'll find that what FDR did is he basically carried out his own shadow diplomacy, his shadow State Department from the White House itself. Okay, it's hard for us to understand this because we've never been involved in government or diplomacy between states, but you have all of these 800 professional people sitting in a building somewhere and people spread out all over the world to carry on your diplomatic activities for you. But when you do that, things get written down. Things get filed away. You have to be public about what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it, right? It's property of the American people. It's American intelligence property. So what he would do is he would get these cronies of his, people like Harry Hopkins or people like Wendell Willkie, for instance. We still need to talk about him, but people like Wendell Willkie or Harry Hopkins or any of these other scumbags that he had around him, he would send them out to carry on private diplomatic arrangements with Churchill, Stalin, whoever it happens to be. And so those private talks, those private arrangements, whatever they come to, nothing gets written down. It's just all understood. And so you basically got Cordell Hull over there in the State Department stewing, hating Japan, working with Roosevelt, but never really taken seriously by Roosevelt. So in other words, people like Cordell Hull and his Jewish wife are glorified babysitters in order to keep the American system of government from working as it had before these people got in and as it was intended to work. Give me just a minute. So what else can we say? One of the big reasons that the Trump regime and the Trump idea was such a gigantic failure is because it seems like Trump was the greatest political campaigner of his generation. He's seemingly indefatigable, did all those events, out-campaigned all of his opponents, is extremely charismatic to normal people. So he has those things in his failure, in his corner, and those are his strengths. However, he comes from a background of business at the upper level, at the top level. And that requires what? Business is all about compromise between these top players in the economy. You've got, 5 rich guys in a room, and they have to decide how they're going to divvy up the profits and fuck the public or fuck the government. And so it seems like that would be good for politics. That's what a lot of people thought. But in practice, we cannot deny the fact that the business approach to government was a gigantic failure. Probably because our government in the West is structured as, loosely related oligarchies. and therefore you as an outsider cannot come into a room with 5 or 6 other people who are in a cartel and negotiate with them. They're just gonna, they're gonna isolate you every time and just lie to you and then do whatever they want. And it seems like this guy never understood this, or he badly miscalculated. He hired all those people who weren't on his team, who were actually part of the very oligarchy that he was trying to work against, and they screwed him every single time. So, what do we learn? What have we learned? Okay, if you're going to be involved in politics or organizational politics, not even in the political world, but just in organizational structures, you have got to have the killer instinct. You've got to have what Roosevelt had. You can't just be charismatic. You can't just be a campaigner. You can't just be someone who connects with people. You have to be able to capitalize on those things. And that's what Roosevelt did. But I guess it really doesn't even matter, because the time for politics is over. At the same time, we do need to understand, what do we need to understand? We need to know how to explain this stuff to people, what happened in the past, what happened in the very recent past, like what's going on now, because you've got to explain to your racial comrades about, how did we get into this situation and where do we need to go from there. And so understanding the failures of this current idea, current situation, and how it relates to things that went on 70 and 80 years ago, I think is worthwhile, and that's why I wanted to share this with you. And so this book, these memoirs by Loy Henderson, are very interesting, but of course we don't have all the time in the world, and this is just one thing from that book that I wanted to share with you guys. Thanks.